"Ma'am, you need to step back from my counter before I call security." The gate agent's voice cut through the humid Chicago evening like a blade sharp enough to silence the conversations of 36 waiting passengers. Dr. Zara Williams stood motionless at Gate C-14 of Chicago O'Hare International Airport, her worn Northwestern University sweatshirt damp from the storm raging outside the floor-to-ceiling windows. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with that particular frequency that frequent travelers learn to hate, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made the exhaustion carved into her dark features even more pronounced. She hadn't slept in 96 hours, hadn't eaten a real meal in 48, and hadn't felt truly clean since stepping out of that Miami warehouse where she'd spent 3 days documenting evidence that would put away some very dangerous people for a very long time. The digital boarding pass on her phone screen showed Seat 2A, first-class flight 447, to Washington Dulles, departing at 8:15 p.m. It was supposed to be an apology from FBI Director Harrison, a small gesture of gratitude for the hell she'd just endured in Miami, tracking a human trafficking operation that had started as a routine financial crimes investigation and ended with Zara watching 16-year-old girls being loaded into shipping containers bound for God knows where. The upgrade was meant to give her a chance to sleep, to drink something stronger than gas station coffee, to pretend for a few hours that the world wasn't quite as broken as she knew it to be. Instead, she was standing in the priority boarding line holding a valid ticket that the platinum blonde woman behind the United Airlines podium refused to scan, apparently, because Zara's scuffed leather boots and faded jeans didn't match whatever mental image this gate agent had of a first-class passenger. The woman's name tag read Brittany Caldwell, and she wore her authority like armor. Her heavily made-up face set in an expression of professional disdain that Zara had encountered too many times in her 34 years of life. Zara shifted her weight slightly, feeling the familiar ache in her lower back from 3 days of crouching behind shipping containers and crawling through ventilation systems. Her messenger bag, genuine Italian leather but weathered from years of fieldwork, hung heavy on her shoulder, filled with encrypted hard drives and case files that could bring down a network spanning 6 states. But none of that mattered to Brittany Caldwell, who saw only what she wanted to see, a tired black woman in casual clothes trying to sneak into first class. "I understand you're busy," Zara said, her voice carrying the careful control she'd learned during her years with the Bureau's Behavioral Analysis Unit, the tone she used when interviewing suspects who might explode into violence at any moment. "But my boarding pass is valid, and I'd appreciate if you could scan it so we can all move forward with our evening." The storm outside chose that moment to unleash another wave of rain against the terminal windows, the sound like machine gun fire that made half the passengers look up nervously. Flight delays had been cascading through O'Hare all afternoon, creating a perfect storm of frustrated travelers and overworked airline staff. Gate C-14 was packed beyond capacity, with passengers sitting on the floor along the walls and others pacing restlessly near the windows, checking their phones obsessively for updates on connections they were increasingly unlikely to make. Zara had learned patience the hard way first as a child, growing up on Chicago's South Side, where waiting was a survival skill, then as a young woman fighting her way through Northwestern University's psychology program, while working 3 jobs and finally as an FBI agent, where patience often meant the difference between catching a killer and watching him walk free. But tonight, with the memories of Miami still raw in her mind and her body running on nothing but adrenaline and determination, her patience was wearing dangerously thin. Behind her in the priority line stood Robert Chen, a businessman in a suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month, tapping his foot impatiently as he checked his Rolex for the 3rd time in 2 minutes. Behind him waited Maria Santos, a middle-aged woman traveling with her elderly mother, both of them watching the confrontation unfold with the uncomfortable fascination of people witnessing a car accident in slow motion. Scattered throughout the gate area, other passengers had begun to notice the tension at the podium, conversations dying as people turned to see what was happening. Zara's phone buzzed with a text from her partner at the bureau, package delivered safely. Miami operation officially closed. Get some sleep, Williams. That's an order. She almost smiled, remembering Agent Martinez's dry sense of humor, even in the darkest moments of their cases. The Miami operation had been a success by any measurable standard. 17 arrests, 4 trafficking rings, disrupted dozens of victims recovered. But success in the FBI's world was always measured against the ones you couldn't save, the ones who disappeared into the darkness before you could reach them. Her younger sister Keisha had been one of those disappearances, vanished at 17 from a bus stop 6 blocks from their childhood home, swallowed by a network that fed on desperation and poverty. Zara had joined the FBI 8 years later, driven by the kind of focused rage that either destroys you or transforms you into something sharper and more dangerous than you ever thought possible. Every case since then had been personal. Every rescue a small step toward the justice that Keisha would never receive. The irony wasn't lost on her that after spending 3 days fighting monsters who trafficked in human misery, she was now being blocked from an airplane seat by a woman who seemed to believe that dignity was something you purchased along with your ticket. Zara had faced down cartel enforcers, and corrupt politicians had stared into the eyes of men who saw other human beings as merchandise. But somehow this moment felt just as significant as any arrest she'd ever made. Brittany Caldwell had been having the worst week of what was shaping up to be the worst year of her 42 years of life, and the sight of yet another passenger trying to game the first-class boarding system was pushing her closer to the edge of a breakdown she couldn't afford to have in front of 36 strangers and 2 security cameras. Her platinum blonde hair styled in an elaborate updo that required 45 minutes and half a can of hairspray every morning felt like it was pulling at her scalp, with each movement adding another layer of tension to shoulders already knotted with stress. The makeup that had looked perfect at 6 a.m. now felt heavy and artificial under the terminal's harsh lighting, but she'd learned years ago that armor came in many forms, and sometimes a power suit and professionally applied concealer were all that stood between you and complete humiliation. The divorce papers were still folded in her purse, along with the custody evaluation that painted her as an emotionally unstable parent who prioritized her career over her 15-year-old daughter's needs. The fact that her ex-husband Daniel had been cheating for 2 years while she worked double shifts to pay for their suburban mortgage apparently didn't matter to Judge Morrison, who seemed more impressed by Daniel's new girlfriend's Harvard MBA than by Brittany's 18 years of perfect attendance at United Airlines. 18 years of dealing with every variety of human entitlement. 18 years of being yelled at by passengers who thought their platinum status gave them the right to treat airline employees like servants. 18 years of swallowing her pride and smiling while people who made in a day what she made in a month complained about the temperature of their free drinks. Her daughter Madison had stopped returning her calls 3 weeks ago, right after the custody hearing where Daniel's lawyer had made Brittany sound like an absent mother who cared more about airline passengers than her own child. The truth was more complicated, as truth usually was. Brittany had worked those extra shifts and accepted every overtime opportunity, not because she loved her job, but because she was trying to build something stable for Madison, trying to create the kind of financial security that would let her daughter focus on school and friends and all the normal teenage things instead of worrying about money the way Brittany had worried when she was 15. But judges didn't care about complexity, and teenage daughters didn't always understand sacrifice, and ex-husbands certainly didn't appreciate the irony of demanding alimony while simultaneously arguing that their former wives were unfit mothers. Daniel wanted $3,000 a month to help support his new lifestyle with Catherine, the Harvard MBA, who'd never worked a retail job or dealt with an angry customer or stood on her feet for 10 hours straight while pregnant. Catherine, who probably thought people like Brittany were beneath notice people who served others, instead of commanding respect. Tommy Rodriguez, her 23-year-old co-worker, was manning the second computer terminal, his dark eyes darting nervously between Brittany and the growing crowd of passengers. Tommy was good at his job, but lacked what their supervisor called professional backbone, The ability to say no to passenger demands without apologizing or explaining or making it personal. Brittany had been trying to toughen him up to teach him that the moment you showed weakness in this job was the moment passengers would walk all over you. But Tommy still treated every interaction like a customer service opportunity instead of a battle for respect. The woman in the faded sweatshirt was exactly the kind of passenger Brittany had learned to spot from 50 feet away. The ones who thought they could sweet-talk or intimidate their way into upgrades they hadn't paid for, who saw airline employees as obstacles to be overcome, rather than human beings with policies to follow and jobs to protect. Brittany had been doing this job since before smartphones made every passenger interaction a potential viral video, back when you could enforce rules without worrying about ending up on social media as the face of corporate discrimination. She'd seen every scam, every sob story, every entitled demand disguised as a reasonable request. The fake boarding passes were getting more sophisticated every year, and passengers had learned to dress down deliberately to play the victim when called out to record confrontations that started the moment they approached the gate with their fraudulent tickets and wounded expressions. This woman looked tired enough to be sympathetic, disheveled enough to seem harmless. But Brittany hadn't survived 18 years in this industry by falling for appearances. The fact that the woman was black added another layer of complexity that Brittany tried not to think about too directly. She'd been through the company's diversity training programs, had sat through presentations about unconscious bias and cultural sensitivity, had nodded along with discussions about providing equal service regardless of passenger demographics. But she'd also worked enough flights to know that certain passengers were more likely to complain, more likely to demand compensation, more likely to turn minor service issues into federal cases. The company's own statistics backed her up. Passenger complaints had increased 40% in the last 5 years, and the vast majority came from people who felt they deserved special treatment without paying for it. Brittany glanced at Tommy, who was studying his computer screen with the intensity of someone trying to avoid eye contact with his supervisor. She could read his body language like a book. He wanted to help the woman, wanted to scan her boarding pass and avoid confrontation, wanted to take the path of least resistance that would probably result in both of them getting written up when the passenger's deception was eventually discovered. Tommy still believed that being nice to people meant giving them whatever they asked for, still hadn't learned that sometimes protecting your job meant being the bad guy in someone else's story. The woman's messenger bag looked expensive, which was another red flag. Genuine leather goods weren't cheap, but they were exactly the kind of prop someone might use to sell a false image of affluence. Brittany had seen passengers spend hundreds of dollars on accessories to support upgrade scams, had watched people coach each other in airport lounges on the most effective ways to manipulate airline staff. The woman's calm demeanor was particularly suspicious. Genuine first-class passengers usually got angry when questioned, demanded to speak with supervisors, threatened to take their business elsewhere. This woman's patience felt calculated, like she was waiting for Brittany to make a mistake she could exploit. Outside the terminal windows, lightning illuminated the storm clouds that had been building all afternoon, and Brittany felt the metaphor settling over her like a weight. Everything in her life felt like it was building toward something she couldn't control, some kind of reckoning that would strip away the last pretenses of dignity and stability she'd been clinging to since Daniel left. But she still had this job, still had the small sphere of authority that came with standing behind this podium and making decisions about who belonged where and who was trying to take advantage of the system. She looked at the woman in the sweatshirt again, at the calm expression and patient posture that felt like a challenge to everything Brittany had learned about protecting herself in a world that seemed designed to crush people who followed the rules while rewarding those who broke them. Whatever game this woman was playing, Brittany wasn't going to let her win. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, heavy with the weight of assumptions and history that neither woman fully understood. Around Gate C-14, conversations had begun to quiet as passengers sensed the tension building at the United Airlines podium, the kind of electric anticipation that precedes either resolution or explosion. Zara kept her hands visible and relaxed, a habit ingrained by years of FBI training where the wrong gesture could escalate a situation from tense to deadly in seconds. Her boarding pass remained on her phone screen, the QR code clear and bright, waiting to be scanned by the handheld device that Brittany Caldwell held like a scepter of authority. The gate agent's refusal to perform this simple action, a process that took less than 3 seconds and happened hundreds of times every day, had transformed a routine airline interaction into something that felt much more significant. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to scan my boarding pass," Zara said, her voice carrying across the gate area with the kind of quiet authority that made people unconsciously straighten their shoulders. "My seat assignment is 2A. My ticket was purchased legally through the FBI travel office, and I have every right to board this aircraft." Brittany's laugh was sharp and humorless, the sound of someone who had heard too many variations of the same story over the years. "Oh, honey, you people always have stories. FBI State Department. I've heard them all. Last month I had a woman claim she was the Secretary of Defense's daughter trying to get an upgrade to London. Do you really think I'm going to fall for some fake government story just because you found a way to make a convincing boarding pass? The words you people hung in the air like smoke, visible to everyone within earshot and impossible to ignore." Zara felt the familiar heat rise in her chest, the same anger that had driven her through Northwestern's psychology program when professors assumed she was there on charity rather than merit, the same fury that had sustained her through FBI training when fellow agents questioned whether she belonged in the Bureau's elite behavioral unit. But anger, she had learned, was a tool that cut both ways. It could sharpen your focus or cloud your judgment, could make you more effective or more vulnerable, depending on how carefully you wielded it. Robert Chen, the businessman standing directly behind Zara in the priority line, shifted uncomfortably as he recognized the undertones in Brittany's voice. He had built a successful consulting firm by reading people and situations, and what he was witnessing felt less like airline policy enforcement and more like something uglier and more personal. His own experiences with subtle discrimination had taught him to recognize the signs, the careful word choices and tone modulations that allowed people to express prejudice while maintaining plausible deniability. "Excuse me," Robert said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard in boardrooms and conference calls. "I'm scheduled for 1B, and I'd like to board as well. Can't you just scan both our tickets and let us proceed? I have a connection in D.C. that I can't afford to miss." Brittany turned her attention to Robert with a completely different demeanor, her posture relaxing slightly as she took in his expensive suit and the confidence that came from never having to justify his presence in first-class accommodations. "Of course, Mr. Chen," she said, reading his name from the passenger manifest on her screen. "I'll be happy to board you as soon as I finish dealing with this situation." The contrast was stark enough that several passengers exchanged meaningful glances. Maria Santos, traveling with her elderly mother to visit family in Virginia, had been watching the interaction with growing discomfort. As a Latina woman who had worked her way up to middle management in a Texas school district, she had developed finely tuned antennae for the kind of treatment that varied based on skin color and assumptions about social class. Her mother, Rosa, whispered something in Spanish that made Maria nod grimly. Tommy Rodriguez could feel the situation spiraling beyond his comfort zone, his training manual knowledge of de-escalation techniques seeming inadequate for the complexity of what was unfolding at his gate. He had wanted to help from the beginning, had seen Brittany's pattern of behavior over the months he'd worked with her, had noticed how her customer service style varied depending on the passenger standing in front of her. But speaking up would mean challenging a senior colleague in front of dozens of witnesses, potentially creating problems that could affect his probationary employment status. "Look," Brittany said, turning back to Zara with renewed authority. "I've been doing this job for 18 years and I can spot a fake ticket from across the terminal. Your story doesn't add up, your appearance doesn't match your claims, and frankly, Your attitude is starting to concern me. Now you can either step aside and let me board the legitimate first-class passengers, or we can call security and let them sort out whatever scam you're trying to pull here." Zara felt the weight of every similar confrontation she had experienced over the years, from department store clerks who followed her through shopping centers to restaurant hosts who claimed tables were reserved when they clearly weren't, from college professors who assumed her questions were signs of confusion rather than intellectual curiosity, to FBI colleagues who wondered aloud whether diversity initiatives had lowered standards for recruitment. Each incident had been small enough to rationalize away, subtle enough to make her wonder if she was being oversensitive, but collectively they formed a pattern that was impossible to ignore. But this moment was different, because this time she had the power to reveal exactly who she was and what she represented. The question was whether doing so would serve justice, or merely satisfy her personal need for vindication. Her FBI badge was in her messenger bag, along with identification that would end this confrontation immediately, and probably result in Brittany Caldwell having the worst day of her already difficult week. But revealing her identity could also compromise ongoing investigations, could create the kind of attention that made undercover work more difficult, could turn a personal slight into a federal incident with ramifications she couldn't predict. A teenage girl named Jessica Martinez, traveling alone to visit her father in D.C., had been discreetly recording the interaction on her phone for the last 5 minutes. She had grown up in an era where viral videos could change careers and lives, where documentation was both weapon and shield, where the truth of any situation often came down to who had the better camera angle. What she was witnessing felt important enough to preserve, even if she wasn't entirely sure what she was preserving it for. The storm outside chose that moment to unleash another wave of thunder that rattled the terminal windows as if nature itself was commenting on the tension building at gate C-14. Emergency lighting flickered briefly as the electrical systems adjusted to the power surge, casting everyone's faces in stark relief for just a moment before the fluorescents resumed their steady humming. Zara made her decision. She would give Brittany Caldwell one more opportunity to do the right thing, to scan the boarding pass and allow her to board the flight she had every right to take. If that didn't work, if the gate agent continued to let her assumptions override her professional responsibilities, then Zara would reveal exactly who she was dealing with. But she would do it in a way that served justice rather than revenge, that created accountability rather than just humiliation. "Ms. Caldwell," Zara said, reading the name tag pinned to the gate agent's United Airlines blazer, "I'm going to ask you one final time to scan my boarding pass. I understand you're having a difficult day. I understand this job puts you in challenging situations, but I am a ticketed passenger with a valid seat assignment, and I have been nothing but respectful throughout this interaction. Please scan my ticket and let me board my flight." Brittany's response would determine whether this became a simple case of customer service failure or something much more significant. The choice, and all its consequences, was entirely hers to make. Brittany Caldwell's face flushed red as she stepped back from the podium, her carefully applied makeup beginning to crack under the pressure of perspiration and mounting frustration. The respectful tone in Zara's voice, the calm professionalism that seemed unshakable even in the face of public humiliation, felt like a direct challenge to everything Brittany believed about how these situations were supposed to unfold. In her experience, passengers who were trying to scam their way into first class either got angry when confronted or backed down when faced with authority. They didn't stand there with quiet dignity, didn't speak in measured tones that made her feel like she was the one behaving unprofessionally. Security. Brittany called out her voice, carrying across the gate area with enough force to make several passengers look up from their phones and magazines. "I need security at gate C-14 immediately." The words hung in the air like a declaration of war, transforming what had been a tense but private confrontation into a public spectacle that would have consequences far beyond anything either woman had anticipated. Around the gate area, passengers began to shift in their seats, some pulling out phones to record what was clearly escalating into the kind of viral moment that could make careers or destroy them. Airport security officer Jake Patterson was making his routine patrol through Terminal C when he heard the call over his radio. Jake was a 38-year-old former Army MP who had seen enough real emergencies to recognize the difference between actual threats and workplace drama, but protocol required him to respond to every security request with the same level of seriousness. As he approached Gate C-14, his practiced eye took in the scene quickly. One black woman in casual clothes standing calmly in front of the United podium, one very agitated gate agent with platinum blonde hair pointing accusingly, and about 40 passengers watching the drama unfold with the fascination of people who suddenly found themselves with front-row seats to someone else's crisis. Jake had worked airport security long enough to develop strong instincts about which situations would resolve themselves with conversation and which ones required more significant intervention. The woman in the northwestern sweatshirt had the posture and demeanor of someone accustomed to being in control, someone who remained calm under pressure, not because she was meek, but because she was confident. The gate agent, on the other hand, had the energy of someone who was past rational decision-making and operating purely on adrenaline and wounded pride. "What seems to be the problem here?" Jake asked, his voice carrying the kind of neutral authority that came from years of de-escalating situations where everyone believed they were in the right. Brittany immediately launched into her version of events, speaking rapidly and gesturing toward Zara as if she were describing a dangerous criminal rather than a tired woman trying to board an airplane. "This passenger is attempting to board first class with what appears to be a fraudulent ticket. She claims to work for the FBI, which is obviously a lie given her appearance. And when I refused to scan her fake boarding pass, she became increasingly aggressive and threatening. I'm concerned for the safety of our crew and the other passengers." The accusation of aggression was so blatantly false that several witnesses immediately began shaking their heads. Robert Chen stepped forward, his business card holder already in his hand as he prepared to offer his testimony. "Officer, I've been standing right behind this woman for the last 15 minutes, and I can assure you she has been nothing but polite and professional. The gate agent is the one who has been escalating this situation." Maria Santos nodded her agreement, her elderly mother clutching her arm as they watched the confrontation unfold. "Es verdad," Rosa whispered to her daughter. "That lady did nothing wrong. The other one, she's being mean for no reason." Tommy Rodriguez found himself in an impossible position, torn between loyalty to his coworker and his growing certainty that Brittany was handling the situation badly. He had seen her interact with hundreds of passengers over the months they had worked together, had noticed the subtle differences in her customer service style depending on who was standing in front of her. But challenging her in front of security and a crowd of passengers would be career suicide, especially when he was still on probation and couldn't afford to lose his job. Zara remained perfectly still throughout Brittany's accusations, her hands visible, and relaxed, her expression calm but alert. Jake Patterson recognized the body language immediately. It was the same controlled stillness he had seen in fellow soldiers who were comfortable with conflict but disciplined enough not to escalate unnecessarily. This was not the posture of someone who was panicking about being caught in a lie or someone who was preparing to become violent. This was the posture of someone who was waiting for the right moment to reveal information that would change the entire dynamic of the situation. "Ma'am," Jake said, turning to Zara, "I'm going to need to see some identification and your boarding pass." Zara reached slowly into her messenger bag, her movements deliberate and visible as she withdrew her Illinois driver's license and held her phone so Jake could see the boarding pass screen. "Officer Patterson," she said, reading his name tag. "My name is Dr. Zara Williams. My ticket is valid. I've been nothing but respectful, and I simply want to board my flight home after a very long week of work." Jake examined the driver's license, noting that it matched the name on the boarding pass display, then looked more closely at the flight information. Seat 2. A first-class purchase through what appeared to be a government travel office based on the booking reference number. Everything looked legitimate to his experienced eye, but he also knew that sophisticated fraud was becoming increasingly common and that appearances could be deceiving. The problem, Officer Brittany interjected, stepping closer to Jake as if she were confiding sensitive information, is that she's been claiming to be a federal agent, which is obviously false imprisonment of a federal officer. I think she's trying to intimidate me into giving her special treatment by pretending to have government authority. The accusation of impersonating a federal officer was serious enough to change the entire nature of the situation, and Jake felt his level of concern increase accordingly. If Brittany was correct, then this was potentially a felony crime that would require immediate detention and investigation. But if she was wrong, if she was making false accusations to cover up discriminatory treatment, then she was the one who could face serious legal consequences. Jessica Martinez. The teenage girl who had been recording on her phone moved closer to get better audio of the conversation. She had already uploaded several clips to her social media accounts, and the engagement was growing rapidly as her followers shared the videos with increasingly outraged commentary. The hashtags #airline discrimination and #Gategate were beginning to trend locally, and several minor news outlets had already reached out asking for permission to use her footage. Zara looked directly at Jake Patterson, her dark eyes meeting his with the kind of steady gaze that conveyed both confidence and concern. Officer, I understand this is a complicated situation, and I appreciate that you need to investigate thoroughly. I'm happy to provide whatever identification or information you need to verify my identity and my right to board this flight, but I want to be very clear that I have done nothing wrong. I have not been aggressive or threatening, and the only reason we're having this conversation is that Ms. Caldwell refused to scan a valid boarding pass because she made assumptions about who I am based on how I look. The statement was delivered without anger or accusation, but its implications were clear to everyone listening. This wasn't just about airline policy or customer service failure. This was about discrimination, about the assumptions people made based on race and appearance about the abuse of authority to punish people who didn't fit someone's narrow definition of who belonged where. Jake Patterson had been a black man in America long enough to recognize the dynamics at play, even if his job required him to remain neutral until he had established the facts. But he also knew that his next decision would have consequences far beyond this gate area, consequences that would follow both women for months or years to come. David Morrison arrived at Gate C-14 with the harried expression of a man who had been dealing with crisis management for the better part of a decade, but had never quite developed the skills to handle it gracefully. As United Airlines duty manager for Terminal C, Morrison had seen his share of passenger disputes, weather delays, and employee meltdowns, but the combination of security involvement and what appeared to be a rapidly growing social media situation was pushing him well outside his comfort zone. Morrison was the kind of middle manager who had climbed the corporate ladder by avoiding controversy and following established procedures, which usually meant supporting his employees, unless the evidence against them was overwhelming and undeniable. His first instinct upon arriving at the scene was to de-escalate by offering whatever concessions were necessary to make the problem disappear, but the presence of airport security and the growing crowd of onlookers suggested that simple solutions were no longer available. Officer Patterson Morrison said, extending his hand in greeting while simultaneously scanning the scene to assess the damage. I understand we have a passenger dispute that needs management involvement. Brittany immediately launched into her version of events, for the third time her story becoming more elaborate and dramatic with each telling. According to her narrative, Zara had been increasingly aggressive, had made threats about federal authority, and had created such a disturbance that other passengers were becoming concerned for their safety. She painted herself as an experienced professional trying to maintain order while dealing with a passenger who was clearly attempting some form of fraud or intimidation. Mr. Morrison, Brittany said, her voice taking on the tone of an employee who expected management support. I've been with United for 18 years, and I've never encountered such blatant disrespect for airline policy. This woman is clearly trying to scam her way into first class, and when I refused to enable her fraud, she started making claims about being a federal agent. I think she needs to be banned from future travel on our airline." Morrison nodded along with Brittany's account, making mental notes about documentation and liability while trying to calculate the potential costs of different resolution strategies. Passenger bans were serious business that required extensive paperwork and legal review, but they were sometimes necessary to protect employees from harassment and to maintain order in what was essentially a transportation system built on trust and cooperation. Zara watched Morrison's body language carefully, reading the subtle signs that told her exactly how this situation was likely to unfold. She had seen this dynamic countless times in her FBI work. Middle managers who sided automatically with their subordinates' authorities, who made decisions based on assumptions rather than evidence, institutions that protected their own interests while paying lip service to fairness and justice. Morrison had already decided who he was going to believe before he had heard her side of the story, and that decision was based not on facts, but on his perception of who seemed more credible and less threatening to his organization. Sir Zara said, stepping forward with the kind of controlled precision that came from years of testifying in federal court, "I'd like to provide you with my account of what happened here, because Ms. Caldwell's version contains several factual inaccuracies that can be verified by witness testimony and security footage." Morrison barely glanced in her direction, his attention focused on Brittany as he asked follow-up questions about airline policy and security protocols. The dismissal was subtle, but unmistakable, the kind of selective attention that communicated hierarchy and credibility without requiring explicit statements about who deserved to be heard and who could be safely ignored. Robert Chen felt his frustration building as he watched Morrison's obvious bias play out in real time. As someone who had built a successful business by recognizing talent and potential regardless of packaging, he found the entire situation both infuriating and depressingly familiar. "Excuse me, mister." "Excuse me, Morrison," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in professional environments. "I'm Robert Chen, seated in 1B, and I witnessed this entire interaction from the beginning. The passenger in question has been completely professional throughout, while your gate agent has been combative and appears to be making decisions based on assumptions rather than actual policy violations." Morrison finally turned his attention to Robert, his demeanor shifting slightly as he took in the expensive suit and the confidence that came from never having to question whether you belonged in first class. "Mr. Chen, I appreciate your concern, but we have established procedures for handling passenger disputes, and I need to support my employee unless there's clear evidence of wrongdoing." "The evidence is standing right in front of you," Maria Santos interjected, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent 20 years dealing with difficult parents and school administrators. "I watched this whole thing happen, and your employee was wrong from the start. She refused to scan a valid ticket, she made assumptions based on appearance, and now she's lying about what actually occurred." The crowd of supporting witnesses should have been enough to make Morrison reconsider his initial assessment, but institutional loyalty and the path of least resistance were powerful forces that often trumped objective evidence. Morrison had built his career by protecting his company from liability and his employees from consequences, and admitting that Brittany had engaged in discriminatory behavior would create exactly the kind of legal and public relations nightmare that his performance reviews were designed to prevent. "I understand everyone has different perspectives on what happened," Morrison said, his voice taking on the diplomatic tone he had learned in corporate conflict resolution training. "But I need to focus on what's best for all our passengers and crew members. Ms. Williams, I'm prepared to offer you a full refund for your ticket and a voucher for future travel if you're willing to take a later flight. We have seats available in economy on the 10:30 departure." The offer was insulting on multiple levels. It assumed that Zara was somehow responsible for the situation. It required her to accept a significant downgrade in service and convenience, and it essentially rewarded Brittany's discriminatory behavior by giving her exactly what she had wanted from the beginning. But more than that, it represented the kind of institutional response that allowed discrimination to flourish by treating it as a customer service issue rather than a civil rights violation. Jake Patterson had been listening to the entire conversation with growing discomfort, his professional instincts telling him that the situation was more complex than Morrison seemed to understand. As a black man who had served in the military and worked in law enforcement, Jake had developed a finely tuned ability to recognize when someone was being treated differently because of their race, and everything about this interaction was triggering those warning signals. "Mr. Morrison," Jake said, his voice carrying a note of caution before we make any final decisions here. "I think we should review the security footage and get statements from all the witnesses. This situation has already attracted significant attention on social media, and if there are any irregularities in how it was handled, that could create problems for everyone involved." Morrison's face went slightly pale as he realized that the incident had already moved beyond the confined space of Gate C-14 and into the realm of public scrutiny, where corporate damage control became much more complicated and expensive. He glanced around the gate area, noticing for the first time the number of passengers who were holding up phones, and the teenager who had been live-streaming the entire confrontation to what appeared to be a growing online audience. The moment when everything could have been resolved quietly and professionally had passed, and now Morrison was faced with a choice that would define not just his own career, but potentially the reputation of his company and the lives of everyone involved in the situation. He could continue to support his employee and risk the consequences of what was increasingly looking like clear discrimination, or he could admit that United Airlines had failed to provide equal service to all passengers and begin the process of making things right. But Morrison had spent too many years prioritizing corporate interests over individual justice to change course now, and his next decision would prove that institutions often choose self-preservation over accountability, even when the cost of that choice is measured in human dignity and civil rights. The radio crackle of additional security backup arriving at Gate C-14 cut through the increasingly tense atmosphere like a blade, announcing that what had started as a simple boarding dispute had officially escalated into the kind of incident that would require incident reports, witness statements, and the kind of paperwork that could follow everyone involved for years to come. Chicago Police Department officers Lisa Thompson and Michael O'Brien appeared at the gate area within minutes of Jake Patterson's request for backup, their presence immediately changing the dynamic of the situation from customer service dispute to potential criminal investigation. Officer Lisa Thompson was a 12-year veteran of the CPD who had seen enough airport drama to fill several careers, but the scene at Gate C-14 struck her immediately as different from the usual passenger meltdowns and customer service failures that typically required police intervention. The woman at the center of the controversy was standing with the kind of calm composure that Thompson associated with people who were accustomed to being in positions of authority, while the gate agent was displaying the kind of agitated behavior that usually indicated someone who was in over their head and trying to cover up a mistake with increasingly dramatic accusations. "Officers," Brittany said, rushing to greet the police with the relief of someone who believed that official authority would finally vindicate her position. "Thank goodness you're here. This woman has been causing a disturbance, claiming to be a federal agent and threatening our staff when we refuse to honor her fraudulent ticket. I'm concerned that she may be armed or dangerous, and I want her removed from the gate area immediately." The accusation of potential weapons possession transformed the situation instantly from civil dispute to public safety emergency, and both Thompson and O'Brien immediately shifted into the heightened alertness mode that their training had drilled into them for situations involving possible armed suspects. O'Brien, the younger and less experienced of the two officers, moved his hand closer to his service weapon, while scanning Zara's clothing for any signs of concealed objects. Ma'am Thompson said, addressing Zara with the careful professionalism that came from years of dealing with situations where initial appearances could be deceiving. I'm going to need you to keep your hands visible and step away from your bag while we sort this out. Zara complied immediately, raising her hand slightly and taking a step back from her messenger bag with the kind of smooth cooperation that Thompson recognized as coming from someone who understood police protocols and had no interest in escalating the situation unnecessarily. But there was something in Zara's eyes, a quality of patient confidence that suggested she was waiting for the right moment to provide information that would completely change everyone's understanding of what was happening. Officer Thompson Zara said, reading the name tag on the policewoman's uniform. I understand your need to ensure everyone's safety, and I'm happy to cooperate fully with your investigation. But I want you to know that Miss Caldwell's accusations are false, and I believe she may be making these claims to cover up discriminatory treatment that began when she refused to scan my valid boarding pass. David Morrison stepped forward, his corporate instincts telling him that police involvement meant the situation had moved far beyond anything that could be resolved with vouchers and customer service gestures. Officers, this passenger has been disruptive and has made false claims about being a federal agent. We have the right to refuse service to anyone who threatens our employees or creates safety concerns for other passengers. The pile-on of accusations against Zara was building to a crescendo that would normally have resulted in her detention and removal from the airport, but Officer Thompson had developed strong instincts about when stories didn't add up and when witnesses were being selective about the truth they were willing to tell. The most telling detail was the behavior of the other passengers, many of whom were shaking their heads or looking uncomfortable with the accusations being made against a woman who appeared to have done nothing more aggressive than ask for her ticket to be scanned. Robert Chen could no longer remain silent as he watched what appeared to be a massive injustice unfolding in front of him. Officers, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I feel compelled to tell you that I've witnessed this entire incident from the beginning, and the accusations being made are completely false. This woman has been nothing but professional and polite, while the gate agent has been hostile and discriminatory from the first moment of contact. Maria Santos stepped forward as well, her arm around her elderly mother, as they approached the police officers with the kind of determined dignity that came from a lifetime of standing up for what was right, even when it was uncomfortable or risky. Es la verdad, Rosa said in heavily accented English. The lady did nothing wrong. The other one, she was mean because of how the lady looks. Jessica Martinez, the teenager who had been live streaming the incident, held up her phone to show Officer Thompson the footage she had captured. I've got the whole thing recorded, she said, her voice carrying the confidence of a generation that had grown up understanding that documentation was often the only protection against institutional bias. You can see exactly what happened and who was telling the truth. The weight of witness testimony and video evidence should have been enough to resolve the situation in Zara's favor, but Brittany Caldwell was past the point of rational decision-making and operating purely on the desperate energy of someone who realized that her version of events was collapsing but couldn't afford to admit she had been wrong. The potential consequences of being found to have engaged in discriminatory behavior, especially with police officers and video cameras recording everything, were too severe for her to contemplate. She's manipulating all of you, Brittany said, her voice rising to near hysteria as she pointed accusingly at Zara. She's trained to do this, trained to make people believe her stories and feel sorry for her. But I know what I saw. I know what she said to me, and I know she was threatening to use her fake federal authority to get me fired if I didn't give her special treatment. Officer O'Brien looked confused by the increasingly complex accusations and counter-accusations, his limited experience with airport disputes providing little guidance for a situation that seemed to involve elements of discrimination, fraud, impersonation, and potential civil rights violations, all wrapped up in a single incident. He looked to his more experienced partner for guidance on how to proceed with what was clearly becoming a significant incident. Officer Thompson made the decision that would determine the outcome of the entire situation. She could choose to believe the gate agent and the duty manager, arresting Zara for impersonating a federal officer and disturbing the peace, or she could investigate more thoroughly and risk discovering that a major airline and its employees had engaged in the kind of discriminatory behavior that would create legal and public relations nightmares for everyone involved, Miss Williams Thompson said, making eye contact with Zara. I'm going to need to see all of your identification, and I'm going to ask you directly. Are you now or have you ever been employed by any federal law enforcement agency? The question hung in the air like a challenge, and Zara realized that this was the moment when she would have to decide whether to reveal her true identity and deal with all the consequences that would follow, or continue to try to resolve the situation without involving her FBI credentials and risk being arrested for crimes she hadn't committed. The choice would affect not just her own future, but the careers and lives of everyone who had made assumptions about who she was and what she represented. And in the broader sense, it would determine whether this incident became another example of discrimination being ignored and enabled by institutions, or whether it became a moment when justice was served and accountability was enforced. Zara reached slowly into her messenger bag, her movements careful and deliberate as every eye in the gate area focused on what she was about to reveal. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as Zara Williams reached into her messenger bag, her movements deliberate and precise under the watchful eyes of police officers, security personnel, airline employees, and dozens of passengers who had become unwilling witnesses to what was about to become a defining moment for everyone involved. The leather wallet she withdrew was worn but dignified, the kind of credential holder that spoke of years of serious use rather than ceremonial display. The snap of the wallet opening echoed across the suddenly silent gate area like a gunshot, and when Zara held it up for Officer Thompson to see, the heavy gold shield inside caught the fluorescent lighting with an unmistakable gleam that transformed the entire atmosphere of the confrontation in an instant. Below the badge, protected by a clear plastic cover, was a federal identification card bearing Zara's photograph and the seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, along with her full title, Special Agent Behavioral Analysis Unit, Washington, D.C. Field Office. Special Agent Zara Williams, she announced, her voice carrying across Gate C-14 with the kind of quiet authority that comes from years of facing down dangerous criminals and corrupt officials. FBI badge number 2847, currently on official travel returning from a joint task force operation in Miami. The silence that followed her declaration was absolute and profound, the kind of quiet that descends when everyone present realizes simultaneously that they have been witnessing something far more significant than a routine airline dispute. Officer Thompson leaned closer to examine the credentials, her experienced eye taking in the weight of the badge, the holographic security features on the identification card, and the unmistakable authenticity of documents that simply could not be faked convincingly. Brittany Caldwell's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, growing horror, and finally a desperate attempt to maintain her rapidly crumbling narrative. The perfectly applied makeup that had seemed like armor an hour earlier now looked garish and artificial under the harsh terminal lighting, and the platinum blonde hair that had been styled to project authority now seemed like a costume that no longer fit the role she was trying to play. "It's fake," Brittany whispered, then louder. "It has to be fake. You can buy those online. I've seen websites that sell realistic-looking badges and ID cards. She's trying to intimidate us with props and fake federal authority." Officer Thompson had been a police officer long enough to handle real FBI credentials on numerous occasions during joint operations and federal case consultations, and she knew immediately that what she was looking at was genuine. The badge had the weight and feel of authentic federal issue. The ID card contained security features that were impossible to replicate, and most importantly, Agent Williams carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to federal authority. Agent Williams Thompson said, her tone shifting to the professional respect that law enforcement officers afforded to federal colleagues. "I'm going to need to verify your credentials through official channels, but I want you to know that I take this situation very seriously." David Morrison felt his stomach drop as the implications of what he was witnessing began to sink in. A legitimate FBI agent had been denied boarding, publicly humiliated, and falsely accused of criminal behavior by United Airlines employees under his supervision. The legal liability alone was staggering, but the public relations disaster was potentially even worse, especially with multiple passengers recording everything, and social media already buzzing with outraged commentary about airline discrimination. Robert Chen stepped forward, his businessman's instincts recognizing a watershed moment when he saw one. "Agent Williams, I want you to know that I witnessed everything that happened here, and I'll be happy to provide a statement confirming that you were professional throughout while the airline employees were clearly in the wrong." The crowd of passengers who had been watching the drama unfold suddenly found themselves part of something much more significant than entertainment. Jessica Martinez realized that her live stream had just captured federal credentials being revealed in response to what was clearly discriminatory treatment, and the number of viewers was climbing rapidly as people shared the footage across social media platforms. Tommy Rodriguez finally found the courage to speak up, his voice shaking as he addressed Officer Thompson. "Ma'am, I work with Brittany and I've been watching this whole situation. Agent Williams never did anything wrong." She was calm and respectful the entire time, and Brittany refused to scan her ticket before she even looked at it properly. The admission from Brittany's own coworker was devastating, confirming what the witness testimony and video evidence had already suggested. Officer Thompson turned back to Brittany with the expression of someone who had just realized they were dealing with a much more serious situation than initially apparent. "Mrs. Caldwell," Thompson said, her voice taking on the formal tone that police officers used when situations moved from civil disputes to potential criminal matters. "You called in a report claiming that this passenger was impersonating a federal officer and potentially armed. Those are serious accusations that initiated an emergency response involving multiple law enforcement agencies. I need you to explain why you made those claims when the passenger appears to be exactly who she said she was." Brittany's world was collapsing around her with the inexorable speed of an avalanche, and her desperate attempts to maintain some version of her original story were only making the situation worse. The divorce, the custody battle, the financial pressures, the years of accumulated frustration and resentment had all led to this moment where her need to assert control over someone she perceived as beneath her had collided with the reality that she had just challenged a federal agent. "I don't care if she has a badge," Brittany said, her voice rising to near hysteria. "She was still trying to intimidate me. Federal agent or not, she doesn't get to threaten airline employees just because she has government credentials. I was protecting our crew and our passengers from someone who was using their position to abuse airline staff." Agent Williams looked at Brittany with an expression that contained no anger, no satisfaction at being vindicated, but rather a profound sadness at witnessing someone destroy their own life through prejudice and poor judgment. She had seen this pattern countless times in her FBI work. People who made assumptions based on race and class, who let their biases override their professional judgment, who created the very conflicts they claimed to be preventing. Ms. Caldwell Zara said quietly, "I never threatened you. I never raised my voice. I never demanded special treatment. All I asked was for you to scan my boarding pass, which is standard procedure for every passenger. Everything that happened after that was your choice based on your assumptions about who I am and whether I belonged in first class." Officer Thompson was already reaching for her radio to call in a verification request for Agent Williams' credentials, but she had seen enough authentic federal identification to know that what she was looking at was genuine. The question now was not whether Agent Williams was who she claimed to be, but rather what consequences would follow from the discriminatory treatment and false accusations she had endured. The revelation of Zara's true identity had transformed the incident from a customer service failure into a potential federal civil rights violation, with implications that would extend far beyond Gate C-14 and affect everyone who had played a role in what was rapidly becoming a textbook case of institutional discrimination and abuse of authority. Officer Thompson's radio verification call to the FBI's Chicago field office took less than 3 minutes, but those 3 minutes felt like an eternity to everyone gathered around Gate C-14 as the full implications of what had unfolded began to sink in. When the confirmation came back that Special Agent Zara Williams was indeed a legitimate federal officer currently on official travel status with a Do Not Detain flag in the federal database, the atmosphere shifted definitively from confusion to crisis management. Agent Williams Officer Thompson said, her voice carrying the professional respect that came with confirmed federal credentials. "I owe you an apology for the way this situation was handled. Your identification has been verified, and I want to assure you that we take discrimination against federal officers very seriously." David Morrison felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead as he realized that United Airlines was now facing a federal incident involving discrimination against an FBI agent with multiple witnesses, video documentation, and social media coverage that was already spreading beyond his ability to control. His mental calculations were shifting from customer service recovery to damage limitation, from vouchers and apologies to legal representation and crisis management consultants. Agent Williams Morrison said, his voice taking on the carefully modulated tone of someone trying to negotiate their way out of a disaster. "I want to personally apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding. We clearly have some training issues that need to be addressed, and I want to make this right in whatever way possible." But Zara was no longer interested in corporate apologies or damage control gestures. Her FBI training had taught her to document everything methodically, to gather evidence systematically, and to ensure that accountability followed wrongdoing with the inevitability of natural law. She pulled out her phone and began making notes, her fingers moving quickly across the screen as she recorded names, badge numbers, and witness information with the precision of someone building a case. "Mr. Morrison," Zara said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had interviewed senators and CEOs during federal investigations, "this wasn't a misunderstanding. Your employee refused to scan a valid boarding pass because she made assumptions about my race and social class. When I remained calm and professional, she escalated to security. When that didn't work, she called police and made false accusations about weapons and federal impersonation. This was a deliberate pattern of discriminatory behavior, not a simple mistake." Brittany Caldwell was watching her 18-year career at United Airlines evaporate in real time, along with any hope of maintaining custody of her daughter or financial stability. The false police report she had filed was a felony. The discrimination was a federal civil rights violation, and the video evidence meant there would be no way to claim it was all a misunderstanding or miscommunication. "Please," Brittany said, her voice breaking as the full weight of her situation became clear. "I have a daughter. I have bills. I was just trying to do my job. Maybe I made some mistakes, but I didn't mean any harm. Can't we work something out?" The plea for mercy would have been more compelling if it hadn't come after an hour of aggressive accusations and false police reports. Officer Thompson had seen enough workplace discrimination cases to recognize the pattern. Initial aggression followed by claims of victimization when consequences became inevitable. Tommy Rodriguez, realizing that his silence had made him complicit in discrimination against a federal agent, stepped forward with the courage that comes from knowing you're finally doing the right thing even if it's late. "Agent Williams, I want to apologize for not speaking up sooner. I saw what was happening. I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid of losing my job. That's no excuse, and I'm sorry." The teenage live streamer Jessica Martinez was watching her viewer count climb toward 6 figures as clips from her stream were shared across multiple platforms with hashtags like #FBIGate and #airline discrimination. She had inadvertently documented what was becoming a viral moment that would be studied in diversity training sessions and legal seminars for years to come. Robert Chen approached Zara with the directness of someone accustomed to making important business decisions quickly. Agent Williams, I'm an attorney as well as a business consultant, and I want you to know that I'll provide whatever testimony or support you need to ensure this is handled properly. What happened here was wrong, and there need to be consequences. Maria Santos and her elderly mother had been watching the entire situation with the perspective of people who had experienced discrimination throughout their lives, but rarely seen it addressed with the kind of authority that Agent Williams represented. Thank you, Maria said simply, for standing up and not backing down. A lot of people would have just taken a different flight. Agent Williams looked around at the faces surrounding her, some supportive, some fearful, some calculating the personal costs of what had just occurred. She thought about her sister Keisha, about all the times she had experienced similar treatment without having the badge and authority to demand accountability about the broader pattern of discrimination that flourished when good people remained silent and institutions protected their own interests over justice. This incident will be investigated thoroughly. Zara announced, her voice carrying to every corner of the gate area. I'll be filing reports with the FBI's Civil Rights Division, the Department of Transportation, and United Airlines corporate headquarters. Everyone who witnessed discrimination and said nothing, everyone who participated in false accusations, everyone who chose institutional loyalty over basic human decency will be held accountable. The statement wasn't made in anger or vindication, but with the calm certainty of someone who understood that justice required consequences, that change only happened when people were forced to confront the costs of their choices, and that her badge came with responsibilities that extended far beyond her specific FBI cases. Officer Thompson was already beginning the paperwork that would document Brittany's false police report, while Officer O'Brien was taking statements from witnesses who were eager to ensure their versions of events were officially recorded. The incident had moved far beyond airline customer service into the realm of federal civil rights law, where the consequences would be measured not in vouchers and apologies but in criminal charges and civil liability. As Agent Williams finally approached the gate to board her flight, nearly 2 hours after she had first attempted to scan her ticket, she carried with her not just the satisfaction of personal vindication, but the weight of representing everyone who had been judged by their appearance, dismissed by their clothing, or discriminated against by people who believed that respect was something you purchased rather than something you deserved simply by being human. The next 48 hours brought consequences that cascaded through United Airlines' corporate structure like a controlled demolition. Each revelation and investigation triggering additional scrutiny that would ultimately reshape how the company handled passenger interactions and employee training. Agent Williams's official complaint to the FBI's Civil Rights Division was just the beginning of what would become a comprehensive federal investigation into discriminatory practices at one of America's largest airlines. Brittany Caldwell's employment with United Airlines was terminated before the end of the week, the company's legal department moving quickly to distance the corporation from what their internal investigation confirmed was clear discriminatory behavior. But the loss of her job was only the beginning of her problems. The false police report charging her with filing a false report with law enforcement, a Class 4 felony that carried potential prison time and would make finding new employment in any customer service capacity virtually impossible. The custody hearing that Brittany had been so worried about was rescheduled after her arrest, but the criminal charges and viral video footage of her discriminatory behavior had effectively ended any chance of winning custody of her daughter. Madison, her 15-year-old, had watched the live stream along with millions of other people and was horrified to see her mother revealed as someone who would treat another human being with such casual cruelty based purely on assumptions about race and class. David Morrison's career suffered collateral damage that was less dramatic but equally devastating. His failure to investigate the situation properly, his automatic support for discriminatory behavior, and his attempts to cover up the incident with inadequate customer service gestures resulted in his demotion to a junior management role at a small regional airport in Nebraska. The United Airlines corporate headquarters made it clear that managers who enabled discrimination through willful blindness would find their advancement opportunities severely limited. Tommy Rodriguez, despite his initial silence, was ultimately promoted to gate supervisor after his eventual testimony helped establish the timeline of events and confirmed Agent Williams's account. His honest admission of cowardice, followed by a commitment to do better, resonated with investigators who understood that institutional change required people to find courage even when it was uncomfortable or risky. The video footage captured by Jessica Martinez had been viewed more than 50 million times across various social media platforms, becoming a case study in how quickly incidents of discrimination could become global conversations about justice and accountability. Major news networks picked up the story, using it as a launching point for broader discussions about racial profiling in air travel and the abuse of authority by service industry employees. But the most significant consequences were felt at the highest levels of United Airlines, where the board of directors ordered a comprehensive review of all passenger complaint procedures, employee training protocols, and bias prevention programs. The company committed to spending $50 million over 5 years on diversity and inclusion initiatives, including mandatory annual training for all customer-facing employees and the establishment of an independent ombudsman office to investigate discrimination complaints. Agent Williams used her 15 minutes of fame strategically accepting invitations to speak at law enforcement conferences, corporate diversity events, and civil rights organizations about the everyday nature of discrimination and the importance of institutional accountability. She made it clear in every interview that her goal wasn't to destroy the people who had mistreated her, but rather to ensure that what happened to her couldn't happen to others who lacked the badge and authority to demand justice. The settlement negotiations between Agent Williams and United Airlines were concluded privately, but industry sources suggested that the financial compensation was substantial enough to fund scholarship programs for underprivileged students pursuing careers in law enforcement and civil rights law. The agreement also included provisions requiring United to implement specific policy changes and to submit to ongoing federal monitoring of their passenger treatment procedures. Robert Chen, the businessman who had witnessed the entire incident, used his consulting firm's influence to help other companies understand the business case for preventing discrimination, arguing that bias wasn't just morally wrong but also financially destructive when it resulted in viral incidents and federal investigations. His testimony in the civil case was particularly effective because it came from someone who had no personal connection to Agent Williams but was simply willing to tell the truth about what he had observed. Maria Santos and her elderly mother became unexpected advocates for civil rights after their witness testimony was featured in news coverage of the case. Maria used her position in the Texas school district to implement new training programs about implicit bias and the importance of speaking up when witnessing unfair treatment, while Rosa became something of a local celebrity for her simple but powerful statement that the lady did nothing wrong. The broader implications of the incident extended far beyond United Airlines as other companies in the hospitality and service industries began reviewing their own policies and training programs to avoid similar public relations disasters. The hashtag #GateGate became shorthand for institutional discrimination, while hashtag #StandUp became a rallying cry for witnesses to speak out against unfair treatment rather than remaining silent bystanders. Officer Lisa Thompson used her experience with the case to advocate for improved training within the Chicago Police Department about recognizing and responding to discrimination complaints, arguing that law enforcement officers needed to be better prepared to investigate bias-motivated behavior rather than simply accepting the first explanation offered by authority figures. 6 months after the incident, Agent Williams received a letter from Madison Caldwell, Brittany's daughter, who was now living with her father and stepmother, but struggling with the shame and confusion of watching her mother's public downfall. The teenager's letter was thoughtful and heartfelt, apologizing for her mother's behavior and expressing hope that the incident would ultimately lead to positive changes that would prevent other people from experiencing similar treatment. Agent Williams' response to Madison was both compassionate and instructive, explaining that people's worst moments didn't have to define them forever, but that growth required acknowledging wrongdoing and committing to do better. She encouraged the teenager to learn from her mother's mistakes and to use her own voice to stand up against discrimination whenever she encountered it. The case became required reading in law school civil rights courses and business school ethics classes, illustrating how personal biases could become institutional problems when organizations failed to maintain proper oversight and accountability. But more importantly, it became a reminder that justice often depended on ordinary people finding the courage to speak truth to power even when that power came in the form of airline uniforms and corporate authority. The lesson that resonated most broadly was that respect and dignity weren't luxuries to be purchased or privileges to be earned, but basic human rights that applied regardless of how someone dressed, where they came from, or what assumptions others might make about their place in the world. And sometimes it took a badge and federal authority to remind people of truths that should have been obvious all along. 3 weeks later, Agent Zara Williams finally found herself in Seat 2A of another United Airlines flight, this time traveling to Los Angeles for a civil rights conference, where she would be the keynote speaker. The flight crew had been briefed about her presence and treated her with the kind of professional courtesy that should have been standard for all passengers, but somehow felt special because of everything that had preceded it. As the Boeing 737 climbed through the clouds above Chicago, Zara allowed herself to process the emotional weight of what had unfolded since that rain-soaked evening at O'Hare. The viral fame had been exhausting. The media interviews had been draining, and the legal proceedings had required her to relive the discrimination and humiliation over and over again for lawyers and investigators and reporters who wanted every detail documented with federal precision. But somewhere above the Midwest farmland, watching the patchwork of fields and small towns spread out below her, Zara felt something she hadn't experienced since her sister Keisha's disappearance 15 years earlier. A sense that justice was possible, that individual actions could create ripples of change that spread far beyond their original circumstances, and that standing up for principle wasn't just personally satisfying, but could actually make the world more fair for people who came after. She thought about Brittany Caldwell, now facing criminal charges and bankruptcy, and felt not satisfaction, but a complex mixture of sadness and hope. Brittany's downfall had been swift and devastating, but it hadn't happened in a vacuum. It was the result of years of accumulated prejudice and institutional enabling that had never been challenged until they collided with someone who had the authority and platform to demand accountability. The question now was whether Brittany would learn from her mistakes or simply become bitter about being caught. The flight attendant, a young black woman named Ashley, approached with genuine warmth rather than the performative courtesy that sometimes followed viral incidents. "Agent Williams, I just wanted to thank you for what you did. I've been working for United for 3 years and I've seen the way some passengers get treated differently, but I never had the courage to speak up. Watching how you handled everything, how you stayed professional and focused on justice rather than revenge, it's inspired a lot of us to do better." Ashley's gratitude was echoed by passengers throughout the flight, people who approached during boarding or stopped by her seat during the service to share their own stories of discrimination and their appreciation for seeing someone stand up against it successfully. An elderly white gentleman from Minnesota told her about watching his black grandson get followed through department stores. A Latina businesswoman shared her experiences with rental car companies that always seemed to have computer problems when she tried to reserve vehicles. A young Asian American student described being asked repeatedly where he was really from, despite being born in Iowa. Each story reinforced what Zara had learned during her years with the FBI. Discrimination wasn't an individual failing, but a widespread pattern that flourished when good people remained silent and institutions prioritized comfort over justice. The incident at O'Hare had become significant not because it was unique, but because it was so representative of experiences that millions of people endured regularly without having the platform or authority to demand accountability. As the flight descended toward Los Angeles, Zara reflected on the letter she had received from her FBI director, commending her professionalism during the incident and informing her that she was being considered for promotion to the Civil Rights Division's senior leadership team. The irony wasn't lost on her that facing discrimination had actually advanced her career by demonstrating exactly the kind of principled leadership that the Bureau needed in its efforts to combat bias and abuse of authority. But more meaningful than career advancement was the message she had received from Madison Caldwell, Brittany's teenage daughter, who was struggling to understand how her mother could have behaved so badly while still being the woman who had raised her and loved her and sacrificed for her education and opportunities. Madison's letter was thoughtful and mature beyond her years, grappling with the complex reality that people could be capable of both kindness and cruelty, both love and prejudice, both good intentions and harmful actions. Zara's response to Madison had been carefully crafted to acknowledge the teenager's pain while encouraging her to learn from her mother's mistakes rather than being defined by them. She had shared some of her own experiences with discrimination. Her memories of watching her sister struggle with systems that seemed designed to overlook or dismiss young black women, and her decision to channel anger and frustration into a career dedicated to making those systems more just and accountable. The conversation with Madison had been healing for Zara in ways she hadn't expected, helping her process her own complicated feelings about Brittany's punishment and the broader implications of what had happened. Justice had been served, accountability had been enforced, and institutional changes had been implemented. But the human cost of the incident was more complex and ambiguous than the legal and corporate consequences suggested. As the plane touched down at LAX, Zara thought about the speech she would give the next day to an audience of civil rights lawyers, diversity consultants, and corporate executives who were trying to understand how to prevent similar incidents in their own organizations. Her message would focus on the importance of creating systems that rewarded people for speaking up rather than remaining silent, that took discrimination complaints seriously rather than treating them as customer service issues, and that held authority figures accountable for their decisions rather than protecting them from consequences. But she would also talk about the personal dimension of discrimination, the way it affected not just the direct victims, but their families, their communities, and their faith in the possibility that institutions could be fair and just. She would share her own story not as a tale of individual triumph, but as an example of how much courage and authority were required to achieve even basic accountability, and how many people experienced similar treatment without having the resources or platform to demand justice. The most important message she wanted to convey was that change was possible, but only when people were willing to move beyond comfortable silence and take risks for principle. Her badge and federal authority had given her unusual leverage in demanding accountability, but the witnesses who spoke up, the passengers who recorded the incident, and the airline employees who eventually told the truth were equally important in ensuring that justice was served. As she gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark, Agent Williams felt a sense of completion that had been missing from her life since Keisha's disappearance. She hadn't been able to save her sister, but she had used her sister's memory to build a career dedicated to protecting others. And now she had demonstrated that even the most institutional forms of discrimination could be challenged successfully when people refused to accept unfair treatment as inevitable. 1 year after the incident at Chicago O'Hare, the ripple effects of Agent Williams's stand against discrimination had spread throughout the airline industry and beyond, creating lasting changes that would benefit travelers for generations to come. The Department of Transportation had implemented new regulations requiring airlines to document and investigate all passenger complaints involving potential discrimination, while the Federal Aviation Administration had mandated annual bias training for all customer service personnel at airports nationwide. United Airlines had become an unlikely leader in diversity and inclusion initiatives, their comprehensive response to the O'Hare incident earning recognition from civil rights organizations that had previously been among the company's harshest critics. The $50 million investment in bias prevention had funded everything from improved employee training to scholarship programs for students from underrepresented communities pursuing careers in aviation and hospitality management. Brittany Caldwell's criminal case had been resolved through a plea agreement that required her to complete 200 hours of community service with civil rights organizations, attend diversity education programs, and make a public apology acknowledging her discriminatory behavior. The felony conviction had ended her career in customer service, but she was slowly rebuilding her life working as a volunteer coordinator for a nonprofit organization that provided services to families affected by domestic violence. The transformation in Brittany's perspective had been gradual but genuine, influenced by her required community service work with people from different backgrounds and her ongoing therapy to address the personal issues that had contributed to her discriminatory behavior. She had written a letter to Agent Williams seeking forgiveness not for legal reasons, but out of genuine remorse for the pain she had caused and the broader harm her actions had represented. Madison Caldwell, now 16 and living with her father, had become an advocate for youth civil rights education after watching her mother's public reckoning and learning about the broader context of discrimination in America. She had started a social media campaign encouraging young people to speak up against bias when they witnessed it, using her own family's story as an example of how silence and complicity could enable harmful behavior. David Morrison, the former United duty manager, had used his demotion and career setback as an opportunity for personal reflection and growth. His new position at the small Nebraska airport had given him a chance to implement fair and inclusive customer service practices from the ground up, and he had become a vocal advocate for management training programs that emphasized the importance of investigating discrimination complaints thoroughly rather than simply supporting employees automatically. Tommy Rodriguez had thrived in his promotion to gate supervisor, implementing new protocols that ensured passenger complaints were documented and investigated promptly rather than being dismissed or ignored. His team at O'Hare had become a model for other airports, demonstrating that preventing discrimination was not only morally correct, but also more efficient and cost-effective than dealing with the aftermath of discriminatory incidents. The video footage captured by Jessica Martinez had been used in countless diversity training programs, corporate seminars, and university courses as an example of how quickly ordinary interactions could become national conversations about justice and accountability. Jessica herself had parlayed her viral fame into a career as a social media consultant specializing in crisis communication and digital activism. Robert Chen had expanded his consulting practice to focus specifically on helping companies develop bias prevention strategies that protected both their employees and their customers from discriminatory treatment. His first-hand witness testimony in the United case had given him credibility with corporate clients who might otherwise have dismissed diversity initiatives as political correctness rather than business necessities. Maria Santos had been promoted to assistant superintendent in her Texas school district after implementing innovative bias prevention programs that had significantly reduced disciplinary disparities among students from different racial and ethnic backgrounds. Her mother, Rosa, had become something of a local celebrity for her simple but powerful testimony about the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their appearance. Officer Lisa Thompson had been selected to head a new Chicago Police Department unit focused on investigating hate crimes and bias-motivated incidents. Her experience with the airport case having demonstrated her ability to recognize discrimination and hold perpetrators accountable, regardless of their position or authority. The broader cultural impact of the incident had been measured not just in policy changes and legal consequences, but in the countless individual decisions by ordinary people to speak up rather than remain silent when they witnessed unfair treatment. The hashtag stand up had become a rallying cry for witnesses to discrimination, while hashtag Gategate had entered the lexicon as shorthand for the kind of institutional bias that flourished when organizations prioritized employee loyalty over customer rights. Most importantly, the incident had demonstrated that accountability was possible, that institutions could be forced to change, and that individual acts of courage could create lasting improvements in how people were treated, regardless of their race, class, or appearance. 5 years after that rainy evening at Chicago O'Hare, Special Agent Zara Williams stood before a class of new FBI recruits at the Bureau's training academy in Quantico, Virginia, looking out at the most diverse group of future agents in the organization's history. The young men and women seated in the lecture hall represented every racial, ethnic, and socio-economic background imaginable, united by their commitment to justice and their determination to serve their country with integrity and fairness. Law enforcement. Zara began, her voice carrying the authority that came from years of experience in some of the Bureau's most challenging assignments, is about more than investigating crimes and arresting criminals. It's about standing up for people who can't stand up for themselves, about ensuring that justice applies equally, regardless of someone's race, religion, economic status, or any other characteristic that makes them different from whoever happens to be in power at the moment. She told them about the night at O'Hare, not as a story of personal vindication, but as an example of how discrimination could flourish, even in mundane situations, when good people failed to speak up, and institutions prioritized convenience over justice. She described the courage of witnesses like Robert Chen and Maria Santos, the transformation of people like Tommy Rodriguez and David Morrison, and the importance of accountability in creating lasting change. The badge you'll earn when you graduate, Zara continued, isn't just a symbol of authority. It's a responsibility to use that authority fairly, to investigate thoroughly regardless of who's involved, and to remember that justice delayed is justice denied, whether we're talking about terrorism cases or airline discrimination. After the lecture, Zara drove to Arlington National Cemetery, where she visited the grave of her sister Keisha, whose disappearance had started her on the path to federal law enforcement. She placed fresh flowers on the headstone and told Keisha about the recruits, about the changes that had followed from that night at O'Hare, and about her hope that the next generation of agents would build a more just world. As sunset painted the sky orange and purple, Zara reflected on the unexpected ways that standing up for principle could create ripples of change extending far beyond their original circumstances. Her sister's memory lived on, not just in her grief, but in her commitment to ensuring that other families wouldn't have to experience the pain of injustice going unanswered. The badge in her wallet had given her the authority to demand accountability that night at O'Hare. But the real power had come from her refusal to accept discrimination as inevitable. That lesson, that ordinary courage could create extraordinary change, was the legacy she hoped to pass on to every agent who followed in her footsteps. The transformation sparked by one woman's refusal to accept discrimination quietly spread throughout American society in ways both seen and unseen. Airlines across the industry implemented new training programs and oversight procedures, while other service industries took note and began examining their own practices before becoming the subject of similar viral incidents. Agent Williams' story became required reading in business schools and law enforcement academies, a case study in how individual courage could challenge institutional bias and create lasting change. But perhaps more importantly, it became a reminder that justice often depends on ordinary people finding the strength to speak truth to power, even when that power comes disguised as customer service policies or corporate procedures. Today, discrimination still exists in countless forms across American society, but it operates in a world where more people understand that silence enables injustice, where witnesses are more likely to document and report unfair treatment, and where institutions know that accountability isn't optional when their biases are exposed to public scrutiny. The badge revealed that night at O'Hare represented more than federal authority. It symbolized the ongoing struggle for dignity, justice, and the radical idea that all people deserve to be treated with basic human respect. If this story of courage and justice inspired you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more stories about people who refused to accept discrimination and fought for what was right. Share your own experiences with standing up against bias in the comments below. Your voice matters, and together we can continue building a more fair and just world for everyone.